The midday sun beat down like a punishment, swallowing the desert in a haze of heat and glare. The firing range stretched endlessly across the barren expanse, a world of silence shattered only by the rhythmic crack of rifles and the faint metallic clatter of spent brass hitting the ground. She knelt there among it all, Private First Class Elena Rowe, collecting empty casings one by one, her fingers blackened with powder, her sleeves rolled past her elbows. The other Marines barely noticed her. To them, she was just another maintenance hand assigned to clean up duty, a background figure in the choreography of marksmanship. But that day, the silence held something different, a tension that shimmered in the air, coiled and unseen. The sniper section had just finished their qualifications. Dust shimmered around their boots as they joked and slung their rifles over their shoulders, men carved by discipline and pride. At their center stood Gunnery Sergeant Cole Maddox, the Marine Corps legend, known across bases as Ghost Eye. He was the one whose name floated in whispered stories, the man who could shoot through a leaf and split it clean at 2,000 yards. He watched Elena from the edge of the shade, his jaw flexing with something unreadable. The heat rippled between them, and when he spoke, his voice was low but carried across the range like a shot. "Rowe," he said, "you missed one." The laughter that followed from the others wasn't cruel, but it burned all the same. She froze for a heartbeat, then reached for the last brass casing near her knee. Her reflection in its surface, faint and distorted, looked back at her with quiet anger. She rose slowly, brushing the dust from her fatigues, eyes steady. "I didn't miss," she murmured. The words were almost swallowed by the wind, but Maddox caught them. He tilted his head, studying her the way he might study a distant target. The range fell silent. "Is that so?" he asked, his tone calm, indifferent. "Then let's see if you can hit something that actually matters." He motioned toward the long, range platform, the one reserved for snipers, an altar of precision, patience, and pride. Every Marine knew that platform. Few ever touched it. Elena's pulse thudded once in her throat, a quiet rebellion against reason. "You want me to shoot?" she asked. The men around them exchanged glances. One of them chuckled softly, shaking his head. Maddox's gaze didn't waver. 4,000 meters. He said simply, "Hit it, and you're done for the day. Miss it, and you keep picking up brass until sunset." The wind seemed to still in that moment, as if even the desert waited. 4,000 meters. That was an impossible number for most. Even trained snipers doubted their luck beyond 3. But something inside her stirred, something quiet and stubborn that had been crushed too many times before. She looked at the rifles resting on the stand, black and sleek beneath the sun, their barrels catching the light like a challenge whispered in steel. Without another word, she walked toward them. The others fell silent as she passed. Some smirked, expecting failure. Others watched with the uneasy curiosity that comes when rules are about to bend. Maddox followed her with his eyes, unreadable behind the shadow of his cap. She reached the platform and paused, inhaling the heavy scent of oil, sand, and old smoke. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the rifle Maddox's own, 408 J-TAC intervention. Its weight was foreign but honest, like holding someone else's story. She rested it against her shoulder, aligning the scope toward the endless mirage of distance where the target, a faint white silhouette, wavered like a ghost in heat. Through the lens, the world narrowed to a single heartbeat. The wind whispered over the dunes, low and constant. Her breathing slowed. Her pulse fell into rhythm. The sun seared her neck. The metal bit against her cheek. And for the first time in her life, the noise of doubt fell away. She exhaled. The shot broke the air like glass. The recoil slammed through her shoulder, but she held firm, her body still, her gaze unflinching. Time stretched long, silent, unbearable. The men leaned forward, squinting into the haze. The bullet's flight was invisible, its story carried on the desert wind. Then, faintly, across the range, a ping. a sharp, metallic whisper that silenced everything. No one spoke. Not a laugh, not a word. Only Maddox moved, his jaw tightening as he stared downrange. Then he turned, eyes meeting hers. There was no smile, no praise, just a long, steady look that said more than words ever could. Elena lowered the rifle, dust swirling around her boots. Her heart pounded against her ribs, not with triumph, but with something deeper, recognition. She hadn't been trying to prove herself. She'd simply wanted to stop being unseen. Maddox nodded once, barely perceptible, and said quietly, again, the word wasn't a challenge anymore. It was an invitation. And in that small moment of silence between them, under a punishing sun and a sky too big for either of them to own, a new story began, not of rivalry, but of respect earned in recoil and dust. Echo of that first shot still lived in the air, thin and trembling like the last note of a forgotten hymn. No one spoke for a long while. Even the desert wind seemed to pause, unsure of whether to carry the sound away or let it linger. Elena stood motionless, her fingers still wrapped around the rifle, the faint ache of recoil throbbing through her arm. She didn't smile, didn't dare. Triumph was dangerous here. It was the kind of thing that invited punishment disguised as discipline. Gunnery Sergeant Maddox's boots crunched over the gravel as he walked toward her. The men watched in silence, each one trying to read the look on his face. His expression was carved in restraint, the kind a soldier wears when the rules inside his chest fight the ones written on paper. He stopped beside her, his shadow stretching across the platform like a second flag. Wind shifted 2 knots east. He said quietly, his tone devoid of mockery, "Try again. No challenge now, just instruction," but it was heavier than any order. Elena adjusted the rifle, the familiar tremor of nerves curling beneath her ribs. She wiped her palm on her thigh, feeling the grit of dust stick to her skin. The world narrowed again through the scope, heat waves bending the horizon, air rippling like water. The target shimmered in and out of focus. She listened. The wind had a voice if you learned to hear it. Soft, tired, carrying the taste of salt and old metal. She adjusted the elevation, her thumb brushing against the cold steel of the scope ring. Breath steady, shoulders aligned, another shot. The crack tore through the range. The recoil slammed against her body, and again the stillness returned, that infinite waiting between heartbeat and consequence. Seconds passed, then came the second ping, fainter but clear. Maddox's eyes flickered barely a change, but enough for the watching Marines to exchange uneasy looks. Something sacred had been disturbed. He knelt beside her, taking the rifle in his hands. His movements were precise, reverent. "Who taught you?" he asked, though it wasn't truly a question. "No one," she said. "I used to watch." He looked up sharply. "Watch," she nodded. "When I was on range cleanup, I'd watch the way you all measured breath, how you read the wind, how the world seemed to stop when you pulled the trigger." Her honesty wasn't meant to impress. It was simple truth, spoken without expectation. Maddox stared at her for a long moment, and something almost human softened in his eyes, a faint recognition of hunger he'd once known himself. The men behind them began to shift uncomfortably. Pride was a fragile thing here, easily cracked. One of them, Corporal Haynes, scoffed under his breath. "Luck," he muttered. She couldn't repeat it at night. The words were quiet, but in the stillness they carried like gunfire. Elena didn't flinch. Maddox, however, turned his head slightly toward Haynes, eyes narrowing, not in anger but in warning. "You think so?" he asked. Haynes hesitated, realizing too late he'd been pulled into something larger than his pride. Maddox stood, his shadow long across the sand. "Then you'll spot for her tonight." The group shifted, uneasy laughter dying in their throats. Orders were orders. Maddox turned back to Elena, his voice lower now. "Zero your sights before sundown. We'll see if this was wind or will." He walked away without another word. The others followed, their boots leaving shallow scars in the dust. When they were gone, Elena sat on the edge of the platform, the rifle resting across her lap. Her heartbeat had slowed, but her thoughts raced, a storm behind calm eyes. She didn't understand why Maddox had done it, why he turned a moment of humiliation into a test that now carried the weight of reputation. But somewhere deep inside her, past the fear and doubt, she understood what the challenge meant. It wasn't about shooting. It was about belonging. As the sun sank low, the desert shifted colors, gold bleeding into copper, copper into shadow. The air cooled, and the base lights flickered to life, one by one, like tired eyes opening. Night fell heavy and silent. The range looked different under moonlight, haunted, reverent, infinite. The targets glowed faintly in the distance, pale ghosts under starlight. Elena adjusted the rifle again, the metal now cold against her cheek. Haynes stood beside her, reluctantly holding the spotting scope. He didn't speak. The earlier mockery had dissolved into something quieter, though not quite respect. Maddox stood further back, arms crossed, watching, his expression unreadable in the dim light. The wind had changed again. Softer, colder. Elena steadied her breath, counting in her mind. 1, 2, 3. She squeezed the trigger. The flash illuminated her face, brief white fire in darkness. The silence afterward felt like eternity. Then faint, distant, almost unbelievable. Another metallic ping. The sound carried through the night, across sand and silence, until it reached Maddox. For the first time, a small smile touched his face, barely there, but real. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Because in that moment, every man watching knew something had shifted. The invisible line that divided who was seen and who was not had been broken. Elena lowered the rifle, exhaling into the cold air. The stars above seemed closer now, clearer, as though they too had been waiting for that sound. And from somewhere deep inside, she felt it. Not pride, not relief, but peace. The kind that only comes when the world finally sees you, not for what you were told to be, but for what you've proven you are. Yet beneath that peace, a storm was brewing, because the Marine Corps did not take kindly to legends rewritten in silence. And by dawn, her name would be on everyone's lips. By dawn, the story had already outrun the truth. On bases like these, rumors traveled faster than sound. Before the first morning formation, word had spread like wildfire. The girl from range maintenance hit 4,000 meters. No one agreed on the details. Some said it was luck. Others swore she'd done it twice. A few claimed Maddox had set her up to fail, and she'd turned the tables on him instead. Every retelling added another grain of legend to the desert wind. When Elena reported for duty, the air around her had changed. Conversations quieted when she passed. Eyes followed her with a mix of disbelief and irritation. The hierarchy of respect was a delicate thing, and she'd stepped on it without permission. Her commanding officer summoned her by mid-morning. Captain Reynolds' rigid posture, eyes sharp as flint, sat behind his desk, the blinds half drawn. The room smelled faintly of coffee and gun oil. Maddox stood by the window, arms folded, private row. Reynolds began, voice smooth and hard. "I've heard quite the story. Care to explain why a maintenance specialist was handling sniper-class weapons without authorization?" Elena stood at attention, her pulse steady but her throat dry. "Sir, Gunnery Sergeant Maddox instructed me to." Reynolds raised a hand. "We're aware. That's precisely what concerns me." His gaze flicked toward Maddox. "This base is not a proving ground for personal experiments." Maddox's expression didn't change. "She followed my order. I'll take responsibility." The captain leaned back, studying him. "You're aware that what she did undermines the credibility of your entire unit. You've got trained men who have spent years perfecting that skill. Now one stray private makes them look unprepared." "She didn't undermine them," Maddox said quietly. "She reminded them what it means to earn it." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Reynolds's fingers tapped the desk once, twice. "I see. His tone softened in a way that wasn't kindness. Then perhaps she should prove it officially, a demonstration in front of the Corps. Elena's breath caught. Maddox's eyes flickered toward her for the first time, a live test. Reynolds continued. If she can replicate that hit under supervision, her record will be cleared. If not, it'll be treated as fabrication and disciplinary review will follow. It was an offer disguised as mercy. Understood, Maddox said. Elena saluted, her stomach tightening with the cold weight of what had just been arranged. She was dismissed without another word. Outside, the sun was already high, burning the sand into light. She stood there, staring at the horizon where the range waited, a vast emptiness that now felt alive, watching her. Maddox joined her moments later. "You didn't have to take the fall," she said quietly. He adjusted the brim of his cap, his voice low. "I didn't, you did." She turned to him, confusion flickering. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes carried something older, regret, maybe, or memory. "You think they'll let you walk away from this?" he asked. "I'm not trying to walk away." He almost smiled. "Good, then don't miss." That night, the range was prepared under floodlights, the desert glowing pale under electric fire. Senior officers gathered, their uniforms crisp, their curiosity veiled behind formality. A row of snipers stood in the shadows, silent witnesses. Maddox was there too, not as her superior this time, but as her spotter against every protocol that tried to separate them. The rifle waited, the same tac, polished, balanced, terrifying in its precision. Elena stepped up, each movement deliberate, controlled. The night air was colder than before, sharp enough to sting her lungs. She lay prone on the platform, cheek against steel, eyes finding the target far beyond sight, a dot of pale canvas glinting faintly at 4,000 meters. Maddox crouched beside her, his voice a low whisper, "Winds cross, north 2.3 mils left, don't fight it." She adjusted. Her hands no longer trembled. The silence around her thickened until the world was nothing but breath and distance. The stars above blurred, the earth beneath seemed to hum. She exhaled and pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed her shoulder, sharper this time. She blinked once, steadying her breath. Seconds crawled by, too long, too cruel. Then, faint and far, came the unmistakable sound ping. A murmur rippled through the gathered ranks, not applause, not disbelief, just that rare silence when arrogance dies and truth steps into its place. Reynolds didn't speak. He only nodded once and turned away, his expression unreadable. Paperwork would say verified performance. But everyone watching knew what had really happened, that a boundary had shifted, quietly but forever. Maddox knelt beside her, eyes still on the horizon. "They'll remember this," he said softly. She looked at him, the night reflected in her eyes. "I didn't do it for them, I know," he said. But what neither of them could see beyond the reach of light, past the dunes where sound faded into silence, was the beginning of the storm that moment had summoned. Because, when pride is wounded, it never dies clean. It festers, and in the days that followed, whispers of insubordination, favoritism, and violation of conduct began to rise. And this time there would be no distance long enough to escape what was coming. The investigation came swiftly, dressed in protocol and paper, but driven by something far more human, ego. In the week following her verified shot, Private First Class, Elena Rowe became a symbol neither side wanted to claim. To some, she was proof that skill could rise from anywhere, unshackled by rank or reputation. To others, she was an inconvenience, an accidental rebellion wrapped in regulation. The desert seemed quieter that week, the base slower. Men who had once laughed freely now measured their words. Maddox carried on as if nothing had changed, though the lines around his eyes deepened, shadows etched by worry he'd never admit. He'd seen this machine before, the way it crushed anyone who forgot their place in it. Elena was summoned to a hearing in the command office. though everyone knew the decision had already been made elsewhere. She stood before a long table of officers, medals gleaming, eyes cold. Papers were stacked before them, her name printed neatly across the top. Colonel Dawes led the session. His voice was slow and deliberate, as though reading from a script. "Private Rowe, you are being reviewed for breach of conduct concerning the handling of restricted weapons and participation in unauthorized marksmanship exercises. Do you understand the charges?" "Yes, sir." He didn't look up. "And do you acknowledge responsibility?" "I followed an order, sir." The colonel's eyes lifted then, grey, sharp, unfeeling. "An order that Gunnery Sergeant Maddox had no authority to give?" He leaned back. "And yet you accepted it?" Her silence was her answer. "Your actions," he continued, "have disrupted command cohesion. Marines are not built on lone miracles, Private. We're built on trust, discipline, and the chain of command." Elena met his gaze steadily, respectfully. "Sir, trust isn't built on silence either." A faint rustle of discomfort moved through the room. One officer cleared his throat. Another looked away. Dawes's expression didn't change, but his knuckles whitened against the table's edge. "This isn't about philosophy, Private. It's about order." Maddox was brought in next. His statement was brief, defiant. "I gave the order. I stand by it." The colonel studied him for a long moment. "You trained her?" "No, sir," Maddox said. "She trained herself. I just gave her a chance to prove it." The colonel exhaled slowly, then said the words everyone had been waiting for. "Effective immediately, Gunnery Sergeant Maddox is relieved of instructional duties pending reassignment. Private Rowe will be demoted to auxiliary range staff." The room was still. No shouts, no protests, just the sound of pens scratching on forms. When it was over, Elena walked out into the sunlight, the air hot and dry enough to sting her throat. Maddox followed a few steps behind. For a while neither spoke. The range lay ahead, silent under the glare, brass glinting in the sand like forgotten echoes of everything that had happened. "Finally," she said, "they're transferring you, aren't they?" He nodded. "Somewhere colder, probably." His voice held no bitterness. "They can take the post, not the shot." She looked out toward the endless horizon. "I'm sorry, Gunny." He shook his head. "Don't be. You reminded them what we're supposed to be. Sometimes the truth costs rank. Sometimes it costs everything, but it's still worth it." They stood there a while longer, the wind moving between them, carrying that faint metallic scent of gunpowder and dust. When he finally walked away, she didn't watch him go. She just knelt down, as she always had, and began picking up the empty shells scattered across the range. Only this time, the brass wasn't a burden. It was memory, proof that even small, unseen hands could change something greater than themselves. Weeks later, when Maddox's name faded from the duty roster and new recruits filled the range, the legend remained. Some said the shot had been a myth, exaggerated by base gossip. Others claimed Maddox had rigged the scope. But there were a few quiet men, steady hands, who knew what they'd seen that night under the floodlights. And sometimes, when the wind was right and the world went still, they swore they could still hear it, the faint ping of that bullet finding its mark 4,000 meters away. Elena stayed on base, her new post quieter, smaller, but she kept going to the range at dawn, when the world was still pale and half awake. She'd lie down in the sand with the same rifle, steady her breath, and take a shot at the horizon, not for recognition, not for redemption, just to remember what it felt like to belong to something she'd earned. Months passed, then orders arrived. Training reassignment overseas. Her name now carried weight she hadn't asked for, whispered quietly through channels she didn't know existed. Maddox's transfer had become a story in itself, the man who'd found a marksman where no one thought to look. Before leaving, she visited the range one last time. The air was cold that morning, the dunes silver under first light. She lifted her rifle, found the same target far beyond sight, and whispered to no one, for every one they don't see. The trigger broke like a promise kept. The shot vanished into the vastness, a single breath swallowed by the world, and somewhere out there, In the unseen distance where truth and myth blur, another echo began its long journey home, because some shots aren't fired to hit a target. They're fired to make the world listen, and she had made it listen